Hi, Cheryl.
Hi, Cheryl.
I said hello to Cheryl Shear in here, not to you. But hi, Cheryl. Anyhow, okay.
Hi,
So I
Cheryl.
want to I want to spend most of the sheet today. I think hopefully I did justice to the run up to King David about all his family and the qualities of the Shevet Yehuda, the traits that are needed by a leader. I want to do a little history today. Most of it will be talking. All right. So to set the table for the actual investiture, for want of a better word, of a king, I want to take us all the way back to the 40 years that we were in the midbar. The 40 years in the midbar, okay? What characterized those 40 years? All right, take a look. We didn't have to work. Bnei Israel didn't have to work. Well, let's go back. They say everybody has common needs. There are basic common needs. Basic common needs for everyone are food, clothing, shelter, right? Those are considered to be the common needs. Bnei Israel in the midbar had the mun for food. They had the ananei hakavod for shelter, or automatic or air conditioning. They also had, the Torah says, simloschol avotza me'alacha v'raglechol avotzeko, which means in English, the clothing that we wore for 40 years, because there was no department stores to go to buy new clothing. The clothing didn't wear out miraculously. The shoe leather didn't wear out either. So we had all our basic needs taken care of. With our basic needs being taken care of, Bnei Yisrael could spent the 40 years in the midbar in a very, very high spiritual level. Because when all your needs are taken care of, and your worries pretty much are taken care of to support your family, you could spend the time in learning spiritual kinds of things, right? And there was leadership, didn't have to worry about proper leadership. You had Moshe Rabbeinu, you had Aaron HaKohen, you had Miriam, you had Yehoshua, probably the greatest leaders in one or two generations that Bnei Israel ever had. So a feeling of well-being, a feeling that everything was right with the world, a feeling of being able to, leadership was there. I don't have to worry about, decisions being made. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was present every single day. His presence was felt with the man, with the Ananei HaKavod, right, with all the miracles, with the water that Miriam took care of. Everything was taken care of. And we were on a very, very high spiritual level. Very high spiritual, probably the highest spiritual level we've ever been. Yes, there was backsliding. There was things about the Meraglim that didn't go well, things about Korach. But on balance, it was a great, great time to be alive. Great, great time to be alive. So we come to the Yarden, 40 years in, and we cross the Yarden. And suddenly, once we cross the Yarden, what happens? What happens? Everything that took us through the Midbar now disappears. The mun stops. Cross the Yarden, no more mun. We go into Eretz Yisrael, okay? No more Ananei HaKavod to protect us from the elements. Right. We have a commandment now that we have to conquer the land. We have to conquer the land, which means there were 31 different kings that lived in Canaan at the time. And the command was for us to go out and conquer, which meant what? Meant war. Meant war. Right? It meant also that people now had to go out, conquer the land, and ultimately make a living, support a family. The parnoso, the support of families, were no longer going to be with the mun, we're not going to be to Shemayim. So what would happen in such a society when we all have to go out, and we know it ourselves, we have to go out and make a living. We have to support our family. And we have other priorities, such as fighting, wars, conquering. Okay, the spiritual level, it's difficult to maintain a spiritual level at such a high madrega, for want of a better word, that there was in the Midbar. After Yehoshua dies, it's not to say that the leaders that came after him were fallible. They just weren't as great as Yehoshua, Moshe, Miriam, and Aaron were. They were great, great leaders. They were shoftim, okay? But things were not the same. People didn't feel the same spiritually. People had to, like I say, devote their time to war. People had to make a living, and certain things that were priority or that were A1 became A2 and A3. Okay. What happened was Bnei Yisrael goes to war, and if you read through Yehoshua, you read through chapter Yehoshua, some tribes conquered their land, other tribes did not conquer their land. And what happened was when those tribes that conquered their land, for whatever reason they had, okay, Bnei Yisrael somehow lost that cohesiveness, that being together, and people grabbed their land, divided their land, and started working the land. Some tribes had land, and some tribes did not have the land, right? And everybody was concerned pretty much about their own welfare. I didn't say anything controversial yet. Please, all right? We'll get there in a minute, all right? I'll answer your question, okay? But people tended to focus on themselves, okay? What do I need? How do I divide my land? How do I till my land? And the great feeling of a ravus that may have existed in the Midbar certainly was lessened. Ada, you had a question. So yes, so Ada's question was, the land was divided, so every Shevet had, yes. The boundaries of each of the Shvatim were divided, but they had to be conquered. They had to be conquered. There were people that lived. When we walked into Eretz Yisrael, it wasn't an empty country. There were people living there. So some tribes were successful in conquering the land quickly, and other tribes were not successful, okay? So we get into after Yehoshua dies, we go into approximately a 400 to 450 year period where the leadership of Bnei Yisrael devolves upon a group of people called the Shoftim. Now, the Shoftim were very, very great people, each and every one of them. Coming to be a leader of Israel implies that there is a certain level of greatness. But what would happen would be, and it was a pattern that if you go through the entire Shoftim, the pattern would be as follows. An enemy would come, would attack Bnei Yisrael, would be originally successful in subjugating Bnei Yisrael. Bnei Yisrael would realize that they had done something wrong, that they needed to do tshuva. They would cry and pray and do tshuva and daven to Hashem for a helper, for a savior. The savior would come forward in the form of a shofet. The shofet would lead the armies out into battle. In most instances, the shoftim were successful. The immediate fear of the enemy was taken away. Bnei Yisrael would fall back into a pattern of being lack of a ravus, each one taking care of themselves, and the pattern would repeat itself again. Okay. It's not that Bnei Yisrael was evil during this period of time. Okay. It's just that they weren't up to the high level that they could have gotten up to. So the pattern repeated itself over and over again. Right? Enemy attacks, Bnei Yisrael prays to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, does tshuva, HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends a shofet to save Bnei Yisrael. The immediate problem is resolved. Bnei Yisrael goes back to doing things the way they did. Okay. And that's what happened for about 450 years. Right? the end of Shoftim, okay, the end of the Sefer Shoftim, there are two incidents, okay, which I gave you the handouts and which I learned with you in depth about 3-4 years ago. Okay. Now these two incidents were placed in. Who wrote Sefer Shoftim? Shmuel wrote Sefer Shoftim. Part of it is quote to tell us the difficulties of there not being a king, and the Shoftim says Ein Melech b'Yisrael Ishkol Hayasha b'Einov over and over again in Shoftim, right? And Shmuel at the end of Shoftim puts in two stories. Two terrible, terrible stories, which we learned. I told you I learned with you at length, and I'm not going to do it now. I gave you the handout should you want to somehow, while I'm talking, go through the stories themselves. So when you take it home, you could read the stories. The two stories, the two incidents that happened were the, what you call Pesel Micha and Pelegish Begiva. These were two stories. Let me just run through these stories for you. Save a drink for me, Cheryl. The two stories, let me run through them very, very briefly. In the Pesel Micha is the statue of Micha. Okay. There was a man from who stole literally 1,100 shekels from his mother. His mother placed the curse on the person who steals the money. The son fesses up. His name is son fesses up. Okay, that he stole it. His mother says, "Oh, look, what a great son I have. He stole from me, but he admitted that he did it. And what I had done, I had set this money aside, okay, to make a statue." So the son takes the 1,100 shekels with permission from his mother, and he goes to a silversmith or a goldsmith or whatever they called them in those days. And he, with the 1,100 shekels, he fashions a statue. Fashions a statue, a pesel statue. What exactly the statue was, the Chazal is not sure, but he an object of worship, right? So now he brings the statue into his house, and he needs a priest. He needs a priest. If he's going to start a new religion, he needs a priest. And lo and behold, one day happened to be walking by. It's a person from a Levite, Shevet Levi, who stops off at Micha's house, right? And he tells him that he's a Levi. And Micha says to him, "You know what? I'm looking for sort of like a priest. I have the statue in the house. Would you become my priest? And not only that, I'll pay you. I'll put you on the payroll. I'll feed you. I'll buy you clothes, and I'll give you a salary." So the Levi says yes. Okay, the Levi says yes, I'll do this, and he's got a little cult going on in the house. He's very happy, Micha. He's got a statue in the house. He's got a priest in the house. He's having minyanim there every Friday night. Whatever he's doing there, fine. Shevet Dan, okay, the tribe of Dan, had not at this time been able to conquer its territory. Its territory was ultimately way, way up in the north, and they had not been able to conquer. So that they were living from here to there. And one day they decided, Shevet Dan, that they were going to make an expedition to get together and to try to conquer their territory. And they happened to pass by Micha's house. Pass by Micha's house. And they see, lo and behold, that Micha's got a statue in there, and he's got services going on there. He's got a priest going on in there. So they say, "Look, we're going out to war. We're going out to try and conquer our territory. Will we be successful?" So the priest, consults with the statue, and the priest tells them, "Yeah, you'll be successful." So done what they decide to do, they go on their expedition, and they are successful in conquering some territory up north. On the way back, the leadership of Shevet Dan attributes this success to this quote-unquote, this bracha that this priest gave them, this blessing that this priest gave them, so that what they decide, they go in and they make the priest a better offer than Micha had. They make the priest a better offer. I mean, you're working for this guy, one house, you got a small million going on here, next to nothing, we'll give you a better salary, we'll put you on a retainer or whatever it might be. And the priest accepts it. Micha gets very, very angry at this. And some harsh words are exchanged. Ultimately, there's some skirmishes that go on. Micha doesn't take this sitting down. But ultimately, the priest disappears into Shevet Dan. And that's the end of that story. Okay? Second story is really, really more concerning, very, very difficult to understand. Goes on for about the last 4 chapters of Sefer Shoftim, and it's called the Pelegish. Pelegish is the concubine of Giva. Giva was a town in the area of Binyamin, not too far from Yerushalayim. And the story goes as follows: there was a man who apparently had some argument with his concubine, kicked her out of the house. All right, goes on for about 3 months. He's separated from her. He has a change of heart, goes to her father's house, and he wants her back. Ultimately, he gets her back, and they're traveling on the road, and they're just outside of Yerushalayim in a place called Givor, and they have no place to go, no place to spend the night. So they squat themselves down in the town square. And an old man comes along and he says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, they tell me we have no place to live. He says, "Why don't you come live with me? Come spend the night with me, and in the morning you'll go about your business." And he takes up the offer, and he goes to, spend the night with this old man. The townspeople of Giva find out that there's a new person in town with a concubine. So very, very similar, and the Torah uses the same language. That's Sodom and Gomorrah. Middle of the night, they bang on the door. They say they want the man and the woman. They want to try them out sexually. They want some sexual favors from the man and from the concubine. So the owner of the house says, I'll give you my daughter instead. The person who has the concubine says, never mind, and he throws out his concubine out, slams the door, leaves his concubine outside all night. The men of Giva have their way with her. They rape her and ultimately leave her in such a way where she will die the next morning. Okay? The next morning, this lovely man through his concubine out, opens the door, which he hears scratching on the door, and lo and behold, it's the concubine in her death throes or whatever it is. She dies, and the bad story, huh? She dies, and the man is very angry at this. He slings her body over his donkey. He leaves. He goes home, gets some carving knives, and carves the body up into 12 parts. Sends it one part to each of the Shvatim. They say to them, I want justice. I want to know what happened here, and I demand a reckoning. All right? So the Shvatim, when each Shevet gets its body part, all upset. So they call a whole big meeting. They realize that this took place in Givor, and they call a whole meeting and they decide what they have to do. So they figure out that this came from the tribe of Binyamin. They send an emissary to Binyamin, and they say to Binyamin, give us the guilty parties. People that participated in this heinous act, we want them. Binyamin says, no, we'll take this as an internal matter. we'll take care of this ourselves. We'll take care of this ourselves. The rest of the tribes are very, very angry at this. They decide to do, they go to war against Binyamin because Binyamin is not doing anything. And 40,000 people of Bnei Yisrael die. They're unable to defeat Binyamin. There are 40,000 deaths. Binyamin goes back, another meeting again. They try, again, this time, different battle attack. They go, fight. Again, they're unsuccessful. More people die. The third time, finally, they realize that something's wrong here. They daven, they do tshuva, they pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they go out a third time against the tribe of Binyamin. But this time they are successful, and almost the entire tribe of Binyamin is wiped out. Right? There were 120,000 men that died from both Bnei Yisrael and from Binyamin. It's a result of this here particular event. Binyamin is left with 600 men. 600 men. That's all that's left of the entire tribe after all these battles are over with. Huh? There are women are alive. But what happens now is that Bnei Yisrael takes an oath that we will not marry anybody from Shevet Binyamin because of this whole incident. And now we find Binyamin, after all of this is over, they're left with 600 men. And the tribe is really in danger of extinction. Now, Bnei Yisrael has to have 12 tribes. If chas v'shalom we lose even one person in our family, God forbid, right? We say the entire family is not whole. If we have 5 children and chas v'shalom one child is not around anymore, we don't say we have 4/5. We say the entire family is fractured. So it is with Bnei Yisrael. If one tribe is missing, the one tribe becomes extinct. It's not a situation where 1/12 of Bnei Yisrael is missing. All of Bnei Yisrael is not whole, right? So now we have a problem on our hands. We only have 600 men left from Shevet Binyamin. Okay? And Bnei Yisrael has taken an oath that they're not going to marry. They're not going to allow their daughters to marry any men from Binyamin. After a while, the whole tribe will be extinct. It was a foolish oath to take. But nevertheless, they took an oath. I don't want to go into how they go about it, but they get around it, I should say. But they did get around the oath. They did find a way, ultimately, for Binyamin to remarry into Bnei Yisrael, okay, and the tribe would start growing again. The problem is with these two stories, okay, and you can read about them in depth. I gave you the handouts. The problem with these two stories is there's a certain commonality in the two stories. Right? What are the commonalities in the two stories? There was no effective leadership. There was no effective leadership. Had a king been around, okay, these things possibly would not have taken place. Right? There was a lack of any feeling of national unity, a responsibility for each Jew being responsible for his co-religionist. Ish kol hayosha b'einov. That's the way Sefer Shoftim ends. Ein melech b'Yisrael. Ish kol hayosha b'einov ya'aseh. Everybody did as they pleased. You have two major averos which a king possibly could have put an end to. In the Pesel Micha, you had the Avodah Zarah. You had a Avodah Zarah. A whole tribe, say Shevet Dan, pretty much getting close to adopting Avodah Zarah, right? You also have sexual misconduct in the Pesel Givor. And probably of the two Averos that Bnei Yisrael can do as a national entity. The two worst probably are avodah zarah and sexual misconduct. Right? Sinful behavior left unchecked causes more sinful behavior, which ultimately causes rot at the root of a nation. So as Sefer Shoftim ends, that's the situation that exists. Okay, that's the situation that exists. And Shmuel put those two stories. When exactly during the period of Shoftim is a big machlokus among Chazal when they took place. Shmuel decided to put those two stories right at the end to lead into Sefer Shmuel, which he wrote, right, to show us the necessity of having a king, right? So that's where we are, okay, as we open the Shir. I want you to turn now to page, in the handouts, to page 10. Right. Page 10. So we'll open this up now with, this isn't Sefer Devarim Pasuk Shoftim. We'll open this now with the questions. The last page, see page 10. It says 10 on the bottom. Shouldn't be difficult. See page 10, Ada, you with us? Those of you who are at home, if you have a Chumash, Pasha Shoftim, and Devarim Sheni. So we'll throw this out with a little question just to set the table. Is there a mitzvah? Is it a mitzvah for Bnei Yisrael to appoint a king? Is it a mitzvah for Bnei Yisrael to appoint a king? Is it a mitzvah or is it a reshus? Wait. Is it a mitzvah or is it a reshus? By reshus, I mean, is there permission allowed to a king to make a king, or is it a requirement that a king be appointed? Right. This is a machlokus of Chazal. Okay. Some of Chazal, when you count up to 613 mitzvot, will not count Som Tosim Alecha Melech as a mitzvah. Most of Chazal, okay, and Rambam, and the Sefer HaChinuch, which I'm going to be quoting now extensively, say that it is a mitzvah, right? Right. Som Tosim is not a chiyuv. Som Tosim is a reshus, according to some. Okay, you are permitted when you come to me and say we want to have a king like all the other nations around us. Yes, you can have a king. That doesn't mean it's a mitzvah, according to some Mefarshim, right? Huh? The king is supposed to be Hashem, okay? Why would some of the, the Chazal think it's not a mitzvah? We'll go through it. We'll go through it very shortly, all right? The commentators do not all agree that it's a mitzvah to appoint a king. They base this on the wording, okay, V'omato asimo alay melech kechol hagoyim asher sivivosai. I want to be like everybody else. And they say wanting to be like everybody else is the wrong reason to want to have a king. Therefore, with that lashon, they say it's not a mitzvah. Okay? The implication is that there is no obligation to appoint a king. Rather, the Torah is giving us permission and saying if the people want a king, it is permitted to appoint one. Okay? This, however, is a minority opinion. Right? Most Rishonim follow the opinion of the Gemara and the Ramban that it is a positive mitzvah to appoint a king. Right? So how do you explain now Som Tosim Omelch that the people will say this? Okay, the Torah is being what the word is prescient, right? Prescient, being able to see the future. The Torah is just telling us in advance, one day it's going to happen that the people are going to come and say to you, we want to have a king. Torah is anticipating that, and that's exactly when we learn next week, Shmuel, will, that's exactly how it happened, all right? Okay. So let's go through. Kisavo, we'll take this apart very, very carefully. Kisavo el haaretz, there's 6 mitzvot now that apply to a king. 2 that are required of the people, and 4 mitzvot that are just required only of the king, right? So I want to set this as the table so we'll understand when we learn about the kings, about David HaMelech, what his obligations were. So let's go. Kisavo el haaretz. So requirement number 1 to have a king was Kisavo el haaretz. You cannot have a king until you come to Eretz Yisrael. Asher Hashem Elokecha nosei loch v'rishto. Okay? So there's 1, you have to come to Eretz Yisrael and you have to conquer it. Okay? You shach the bar and you have to settle in it. Right? You're marto. Then you come say, Osimo alai melech, I want to set a king upon me. I want to be like everybody else. And we'll see that Shmuel next week, when we learn this, gets very, very angry at this. Because I want to be like the Goyim is never an excuse for Bnei Yisrael to base that as an action on what they do something. Torah then says, Som tosim alecha melech. You can, in fact, place upon yourself a king. Okay? And the language, is it a rishus or is it a mitzvah? Okay? Asher yivchar Hashem lo kachabo. Very important thing. You can't just appoint somebody to become king. The king has Asher yivchar Hashem lo kachabo. The king has to be appointed to somebody that Hashem chooses. Has to be the chosen of Hashem. And what we will say this is, he has to have the shemen, and he has to have the approval of Beit Din and a Navi, Beit Din and or a Navi. Either the courts or the prophets at that time, right? That's proof of you can't go out on the street and just get anybody. The person that you appoint the king has to have a Jewish mother. He has to be a Jew halachically. Okay? Has to have a Jewish mother. He has to be halachically Jewish. Now, so those are the mitzvot that are, or the commandments that apply to the people. These are not for the king, all right? Now, for the king, following mitzvahs, rak lo yabelo susim. The king can't, and we'll go into this in detail in a moment, he can't amass for himself a lot of horses. Okay? Lo yoshives o mitzrayim. He can't settle people or can't invoke policies that send people back to live in Mitzrayim. The man habosus, in order to increase his horses. We'll talk about that in depth in a minute. It's a commandment in the Torah that you cannot go back and live in Mitzrayim. Huh? Lo yabelo noshim. He can't have too many wives. And we'll see what that means. Is there a question? Lo yab, huh? Not yet. Lo yasur levavo, because the wives will turn his heart away from what he has to do. The chesed v'zohav lo yaber lo miyod, and he can't amass great wealth. Okay, he says, of course. When he is installed, when he's installed as king, he has to have a Sefer Torah present with him right next to his throne at all times. Now, there's a commandment on a king to write a Sefer Torah. If the king is not capable of writing a Sefer Torah, he has to have a Sefer Torah written especially for him, and that Sefer Torah must be next to the throne, in the throne room. And the Torah shall be with him. He has to sit and learn Torah, the king. The man yilmad, the purpose of learning the Torah for the king, is liyiras Hashem Elokov, lishmo is called divrei haTorah azos, yaseh chukum le'lasosam. He has to, again, rule al pi haTorah. The vilti rum lebo bo miyachav. Purpose of learning Torah is Torah teaches us humility. So levilti rum lebo bo miyachav. He has to learn Torah so he doesn't become, hey, I'm king. He doesn't develop a feeling of being haughty, being above the people. Levilti surmen a mitzvah yomim small, that he shouldn't turn away from the mitzvot. The man yarich yomim malachto hu v'no b'kerev Yisrael. A king who follows the Torah is ensured by God that his kingship will be lengthened. He'll have a long kingship, and his children will inherit him. That's the Torah. Okay, let's go. Yeah. Okay, how come the question is, how come it doesn't speak about the person who has to anoint him? Because that's not the mitzvah in the Torah, all right? Those are more procedural types of things, right? Shaul did not get anointed with a certain type of shemen. David HaMelech did. That was left up to. That would be left up to Shmuel to decide what has to be done and how it had to be done, right? Okay. All right. So I want to turn myself now to, in a couple of minutes left, the focus to the institution of the monarchy. Okay. We said two apply to Bnei Yisrael and 4 apply to the king, right? The commandment to appoint a king, Shenitztavu Lamanos Aleinu Melech, we're commanded to appoint ourselves a king, all right, over the Jewish people. Yekaptsenu Kulonu Yisnaigu Bechepso, who will gather us all together and lead us per his will. Yalzen Namar Som Tosim Alach Melech, like Hadah said, so very, very clear. Som Tosim Melech means you are commanded, right? This is according to Sefer HaChinuch. This is the minority opinion. There are, I said to you, majority opinion. There are minority opinions. Okay, all right. The underlying purpose of the mitzvah, Meshorshe HaMitzvah, Kosafti B'Sefer Tav V'Lav. Okay, I've written it previously. He says, okay, there I discuss at length the benefit that emerges for people. It's always better that people have one leader. You know, you have many leaders speaking in many voices. You have tumult. Okay? For without this, peaceful national coexistence is not sustainable. You can see in the book of prophets how it's deemed a curse for many men to be serving as a leader in one place. Okay, that's why a shul has one president, right? Although many leaders. Mitzvah. Among the laws of this mitzvah, okay, She'ein ma'amidim melech b'Yisrael batchila LLP based in. I'm reading my own notes. If you don't have it, listen. She'ein ma'amidim melech b'Yisrael batchila LLP based in shall shivim zekenim v'alpi novi. A king cannot be established unless there is based in. Okay, it's based in of 70 and a novi. Okay. All right. Masha Omru, Shema Midim Isha B'Malchus. And here's another thing. Some Tosim Melech below Malko. We are prohibited from the Torah, sorry ladies, to establish for ourselves a female king, a female leader. Right? It's stated Melech below Malko. Okay. And when we have a king, they would anoint him with oil. Once he's appointed, he acquires kingship for himself and his descendants. This is only when it's a melech from Yehuda, because Shaul did not get anointed this way. Okay? All right. Then it goes into some more. I'll skip that because we're running out of time. Right? Masha Amru Zichlon Rabracha, how we relate to a king. Shetihei emu emoso alecha. You must fear the king. You must fear the king. You must have awe for the king. Okay, Kolomar, Shenira Oso, we are to fear him. V'nemin l'dvora b'chol davar shelo yitzava keneged haTorah. Anything the king says that is not keneged haTorah, against the Torah, we are required to listen to the king. All right? V'nechbadehu, yes. And that's not against the Torah. Okay? The unechabdehu, the sachlis hakov the royal boss of Adam. We are to honor him with the utmost honor befitting a mortal. The chomisha yavo mitzvahs melech shehukam al pi Torah. Moreover, anyone who transgresses the command of a king who is appointed in accordance with Torah law, or mored b'shum inyan, rebels against them in any manner, or shus biyad melech lahargo, the king has a right to kill him. Right? And in doing so, the king is not guilty of any wrongdoing. To the extent that okay, let's go. That Uriah was chayev, that Uriah, the whole story of Bathsheba, was chayev misa, because King David told him go back and sleep with your wife, and he didn't do it. He said, my men are on the battlefield. They're not enjoying their wives. I'm not going back to my wife. He was technically didn't follow the command of the king. Okay? All right. Okay. Next. The king also has Shereshus biyad hamelech lasos derech b'emtza hasodos v'akromim. The king, for national purposes, can take your field, cut your field in half, and put a pathway through the field. Today, it's come down to us as somehow as the right of eminent domain. It was such a concept that existed that the king needed this for security purposes or for war purposes, right? He was able to take your field and put a highway or a road right through your field, right? Right. Okay, that the king was able to judge people as to what appears to them to be the truth, even without clear testimony of witnesses. In other words, if the king sees you doing something wrong and he decides that you have to die, he's able to sentence you to death, even though there were no Adam. The king has the right in an extrajudicial proceeding to condemn you to death. Right? Now, the king's personal effects, right? Ein rochvin al suso. We are not permitted to ride ever on a king's horse. Okay. Remember, this is what Mordechai did with Haman. Remember, right? We are not permitted to ride on the king's horse. Okay. Ein yoshvin al kiso. We're not allowed. Nobody's allowed to sit on his throne. Ein nostim al monoso. You cannot marry a king's widow. Right. You can't use any of the king's personal belongings, right? And all of these rules were put in effect to give proper stature and honor to the king. And when a king dies, Caleb nisraf the Fimitaso. All his personal effects were burnt before his bier. Okay? Right. Now, Umasha Amru Shamelech Shemachal Kavodo in Kavodo Machal is a thing that, I'm giving up my kavod. Give somebody else the aliyah or give somebody else the amud. I'm Michael my kavod. A king is not allowed to do that. A king is never allowed to mochel his kavod. B'chol had vorim ha'elu All these things that I am enunciating, this chinuch is talking about, was done to enhance the people, for the people's benefit. Right? Okay. Now, he goes even further. I don't know, well, we'll skip over, we're running out of time. That a person, we'll skip that. All right, let's go into the 4 halachas of a king, right? From prohibition to marry too many wives, right? Understood, right? Wow, how did Shlomo HaMelech get away with it? Huh? So what is considered to be too many? Before Shem asks, what are too many? 18, exactly. A king is permitted to have up to 18 wives. Right? So say over and over again, the problem with having 18 wives is not so much the wives, but it comes with mothers. So you have 18 mother-in-laws. And if anybody wants to deal with 18 mother-in-laws and consider yourself to be normal, call hakavod if you can get away with it. 18 mother-in-laws. And that might have been Shlomo's downfall because he had 1,000 wives, which means he dealt with 1,000 mother-in-laws. Okay? All right. Okay. So 18 wives, according to the Rambam, right? Gemara explicitly states that this mitzvah does not apply to regular men who are allowed to marry as many women as they want. This was al pi Torah. This is before Rabbi Gershom's dictum that you can have 2 wives. In Torah times, you were able to marry as many women as you want. Okay. Okay. Right. Next, prohibition to have too much money. Understood. Money is the quote unquote, they say, the root of all evil. Held true in those times. Okay. The mitzvah to have a second Torah scroll. Why? Understood. I explained it to you. Okay. You look in the Torah, you read the Torah teaches you humility. Torah teaches you the proper derech to go, right? So if the king had a Torah with him all the time, it was presumed that he would follow the Torah. Or if he was doing something wrong or didn't know what to do, he would have the Torah with him for research, be able to learn the Torah and to do it, right? The interesting thing is not to have too many horses, right? Why horses? The horses are connected with Lo Yoshuva Mitzrayim. Apparently, in those days, okay, Mitzrayim, Egypt, had the monopoly on horses. The finest horses in the world came from Egypt. The finest horses in the world came from Egypt. Okay? And in order to do commerce and business, okay, they were very, very wary, W-A-R-Y, wary, that the king should not be signing alliances with Egypt, because when you become friends and alliances, what do? You go, okay, I'll settle there, I'll send a delegation over there, I'll open an embassy there, my people will come to live there, right? And this is what the Torah was afraid of, okay? That this would lead, this alliance, or this procurement of horses from Egypt would lead to an alliance with Egypt, right? And then would lead ultimately to the people going back and settling in Egypt, which there is a Torah prohibition of doing. And then there's a question, but there were so many Alexandria and other great communities of Jews living in Egypt. How was that permissible? How did that come? That's a whole separate share that if somebody wants to give on Shavuos night, they can do that. How the Jews were permitted to establish communities in Egypt, and the Torah says that they couldn't. It's a separate discussion. Also, horses, even down to today, horses are a source of great pride and wealth. You know, people breed horses. Horses become very valuable. Horses are, I don't want to say worship today, but horses are likened for their beauty. A Secretariat, what a beautiful horse it was. You know, and the way they treated Secretariat, better than some human beings. the Torah didn't want us falling into that trap. The Torah, the Chazal say, yes, horses were beautiful objects, and like a car. Horses were very beautiful objects, and horses were valuable. Yeah, I know I got to end. I'm going to end. I'm getting to where I have to end. There is a program for Yom HaZikaron starting at 11 o'clock sharp, and people need time to get to that. So I'll end it here. Next week, if we'll please follow the announcements, I may have to go up north for a family